Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Katherine Ozment, and you have written a book called Grace Without God. I'm going to hold up the Kindle edition. If you have an actual physical edition, I've been reading the Kindle edition, but we could do a little double promo here. If
I've
you want
got
to put it
the
up.
real thing here,
Okay.
the paper thing.
Okay, looks better when you're not looking at it through a cracked smart screen phone. The subtitle is The Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Belonging in a Secular Age, and that's exactly what the book is about. It's about the question of how you find things like meaning, purpose, and belonging if you don't believe in God. And you've, done a lot of kind of anthropology. You've talked to some scholars about this, about kind of the psychology and philosophy of it, but you've also traveled around the country talking to groups of people who are trying to do exactly this. Ranging from kind of humanist groups to what I think you call religion light groups, like Unitarians and so on. See how they handle all the big questions. Why don't, but you start the book off talking about a thing that happened with your son when he was very young. You were looking out the window. At that time, there was, I guess, a Greek Orthodox church outside of your home, and there was some religious procession. And your son asked what was going on, and you explained to him, well, these are people, and they have a particular denomination, and so on. These are Christians, and he said, and what are we? And you said, you were kind of taken aback, and you said, well, we're nothing. And then you came to regret that answer. And that set you, I guess, on your search for the search or whatever. And about that same time, in your capacity as a journalist, I guess you came across this concept of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, that was starting to get attention. Do you want to talk a little about that, what it is, and how you happened upon it? And how
Sure. So that was about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. My son was 8, and he and I were watching this procession right outside our window. There's a Greek Orthodox church right there. And it was a Friday night, and probably 100 people were coming down the street with candles, dressed in nice clothing. There was a priest. There was this chariot-like thing that was draped in flowers, and they stopped directly in front of our window. And my son and I sat there and watched this elaborate pageant, really, unfold. And after they were done, they walked into the church and closed the doors, and that was that. And my son looked at me and said, what was that? And I said, it was a ritual. And he said, why don't we do that? And I said, because we're not Greek Orthodox. And so he said, well, what are we? And I just blurted out, we're nothing. And the thing is, I was raised Presbyterian. My husband was raised Jewish. And when we got married, we thought we would figure something out. We would raise our kids with some kind of religious community and practice and that sense of belonging to something. And we never found that place for ourselves where we felt comfortable, so that our kids weren't getting anything at all. And right when I pitched this as an article. I was a magazine contributing editor to Boston Magazine, and I pitched it to my editor, who said, please write about this concept of raising kids without religion, because I got kids and I want to know what to do and if this matters. And so I started writing it, and it was in 2012 when the Pew Foundation came out with these startling statistics that 20% of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. They're called the nuns, not Catholic nuns, but religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S's. They choose none of the above.
As in none of the above in the survey they take.
Yeah, exactly. And so I realized it wasn't just about me and the editor and the people we knew, but it was a really common phenomenon.
But these aren't, just to be clear, these are not all atheists, right? They're not even all agnostics. They're just people who don't identify with a particular denomination, right?
Exactly. So nuns are made up of atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious people. Most of the nuns believe in God, but they no longer identify with one religious group. They don't affiliate with the institution anymore. They're they've left. They've become disconnected from the institution itself, and they're figuring out all these things on their own.
And the number of nuns has started growing rapidly in recent years, right? It's now around 25% of Americans.
Yeah, and so that was 20% in year 2012, and now in 2016 it's almost 25%. And for generations, it hovered at 7 or 8%. And it was around 1990 when it started to go up. I interviewed Bob Putnam about this phenomenon early in my research, and he said the chart looks like a hockey stick. It's really, really, really flat for generations, and then in 1990 it starts to climb. And so that's about when I graduated from college. So I wanted to look at that climb. Who are these people? Why are they doing this? And what are they doing instead?
Okay. And thus begins your search. One question I have is, how pressing would you have considered the search had you not had children? In other words, was there something really missing from your life, or did you just start feeling kind of guilty about not being able to answer all the deep questions your kids had and give them the kind of thing you had as a child?
So the kids were always asking, and I have 3 kids, and they were always asking questions, questions about life and death and why we're here. And I didn't really have a structured worldview that I could really answer those questions. I felt like I had to have religion to answer those questions. But even before I had kids, I really wrestled with this idea of meaning without God. I was raised to believe in God, and that we were part of a divine plan, and that gave our lives meaning and purpose. And when I lost that belief, I really struggled in my 20s to understand how life had meaning. If when we die, we just die. And so that was the beginning of it. And I think when the kids came along, there was this urgency that came with that, because then I had to really figure out what I believed and figure out a way to find comfort in that, so that I could explain to my kids what my worldview was.
Okay. But it had been a problem for you. It was an issue even independent of your kids.
Yeah, I came from a pretty religious background. My parents were raised in Arkansas. My relatives were Presbyterians and attended church regularly, and religion was really a part of their everyday lives. And so to start to detach from that felt like, well, then what should I be doing instead, or what's wrong with me? And a lot of those feelings that people have when they leave a religious group. And so I think that started, back in my 20s.
Although it sounds like your religious upbringing had itself kind of evolved as your parents evolved. I mean, it's interesting. Their own histories kind of track the process the secularization process we're talking about. I mean, it sounds like they both, at an early age, had been quite involved with religion. Your mother went to Bob Jones University for a year, right? And I guess your father went to divinity school or something. But it sounds like they became a little less. They were becoming less religious as you were growing up. Eventually, they get divorced. Your mother sounds like a little new agey, gets into meditation and stuff. And so there, as you were growing up, you were almost reflecting the evolution of American culture, it sounds like.
I think so. I think that a lot of people in my generation had a similar experience where in the 60s and 70s there was this loosening. And so by the time I came along, my mother wasn't going to church, even though she had been raised extremely devout and, hosted Bible study at her house on Wednesday nights and went to Bob Jones University, all these things. By the time I came around, she was spending Sunday morning gardening and listening to James Taylor on her headphones and practicing yoga and meditation. And so a lot of that stuff in the 60s had seeped into even our very suburban life. And she was not a hippie. She was older than that. But a lot of that stuff had influenced her. And so I think that when I was growing up, it wasn't that religion was very strongly planted in me. And I had a somewhat unusual situation because my parents were divorced. And when I visited my stepmother, they were religious, and they would go to the Episcopal Church. And so that's when I really started to get into religion, or at least sort of get a sense of what it was about. But when I was with my mother, I more had this sort of this idea that, you know, you kind of create spirituality in nature or in creative tasks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so at the beginning of the book, you say there are several main areas in which religion has served human needs: identity and belonging, rituals, shared stories, moral authority, and belief in God and the afterlife. We'll talk about these things in turn, but which of them would you say is kind of the most challenging gap to fill if you don't believe in God? I mean, I guess obviously belief in God is very hard to fill if you don't believe in God, but removing that one from the list, you know, ritual, moral authority, belief in the afterlife, and so on. What's the, where I guess belief in the afterlife stands in for concern about death, you know, right? Is the psychological issue that addresses, like, what's the, you know, at the end of your journey, were there some things you felt were easier, some needs you felt were easier to fill from a humanistic standpoint than others?
Yeah, so I think it's very hard without belief in God to get people to come together regularly and fully commit. I think there is, you know, and I talk about some of the research about the importance of the monotheistic God to affect behavior, but also this sense of we're going to meet every Sunday and we're going to go through these costly rituals, you know, because we believe in this greater power. And so when you remove that, I find that the biggest challenge in a secular age is the individualism that keeps us from committing to coming back together and to say, look, this is sacred. This time is sacred. We're going to all be here at this time and do this thing. It's very hard to do, I think, in the modern age, where everyone is sort of living these highly curated existences in which we're after pleasure and achievement. But I think what gets lost in some of this is that sense of the greater good, the greater whole. And if there's not a belief in God, I think it's a real challenge. And I've talked to a lot of, you know, humanist leaders who are working to try to create these alternatives for people who don't believe in God. And I think that is their challenge, is getting people to just say, okay, yes, we're going to do this. And one of the things about humanism is it values discussion and debate. And and so a lot of times it's hard to corral people to come together. And I think that is the challenge. Now, there's another difference, though. It's not just religious and non-religious. I also think there's a joiner and non-joiner issue going on. And so some of these humanist groups are very robust, and they have the same people coming every week. And these are people who really want to join things and really miss the community. A lot of people told me they miss communal singing, they miss communal rituals of religion, but they couldn't go back to their church or their synagogue. And so I think a lot of those people that are joining and leading these groups are joiners. And I think a lot of the people who are kind of like a little bit more lost and are sort of, they wouldn't join a church and they wouldn't join a humanist group either. And so sometimes these divisions between religion and non-religion are not 100%, you know, capturing this phenomenon.
So this is interesting. I mean, I would have thought you might say, well, the hardest problem in the end is death. Right? I mean, you can, in principle, as far as a sense of belonging, you can get people to gather, you can invent rituals and so on, but it sounds like one thing you're saying, which is interesting, and I think probably valid, is that once you take away belief in God, even things that might not seem like they are inherently connected to belief in God, like just getting people to meet and do rituals, become much more challenging because people have tended to do those out of a sense of kind of divine mandate, I guess. And a question I have related to this is, you know, you go to these groups like, you know, Sunday Assembly, and I've been to the Sunday Assembly in Silicon Valley and in San Jose, and you go to, you know, the Ethical Culture group, I think, in Brooklyn. Have you found any gathering like this that's either like straight secular humanist, like Sunday Assembly, or kind of religion light, as you put it, like Unitarian or maybe arguably Ethical Cultural Society? Have you found any of these groups that seem to have a very young demographic? Because I haven't. I've been to some of these, and I've never seen one that had an average age in the congregation as young as the average age that I recall when I was a kid going to church. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there? I mean, I would think it's a bad sign if all you find in these groups is like, people my age and older. That's not good news.
Yeah, but I think that is changing, actually. And, one of the best examples is the humanist community at Harvard, which is right in the middle of Cambridge. And they have a new secular Sunday school headed up by E.O. Wilson. I think he's given some funds to get that going. And when I lived in Boston, I live in Chicago now, we would go very often to the Humanist Hub. They had these great volunteer activities for kids. And so one of the great things about church is it gets people to volunteer and do, charitable giving and stuff. And so we would take the kids for park cleanups and meal packing that were all run through that Humanist Hub. Now, they're a little unusual, and I think they're kind of pioneers, and I think they're on the cutting edge, but they're starting up coming-of-age rituals for their kids that are going to go through the program there. And I think that's the beginning of something different than what you're describing. I agree. I think historically those groups have been skewed much older, and they've been people sitting around talking about how, dumb it is to believe in God, just kind of crotchety, discussion. And now you find a place like the Humanist Hub, they've got something almost every night. They've got reading groups, they've got this kids program, they have a Sunday program, they have meditation nights. So they're trying to do the full thing for a lot of people, and I think more and more groups are trying to do that. And I think exactly because of the kind of question I had when my son said, "What are we?" and I said, "We're nothing." I think so many people have left religion, and when they have kids, they think, "Where can I go?" And so they start to create these groups. I met a number of them.
Mm-hmm. So is that affiliated with Harvard? The whole Humanist Hub?
No, the Humanist Hub is not, but the person who runs it, Greg Epstein, it happens to be the Humanist chaplain at Harvard. But this is a separate entity, so he kind of does both. And you do find that a lot of these groups are near college campuses, or right on college campuses, because there's so many college students who are non-religious, who are drawn to these. And so they get a lot of volunteers through that.
And what are the coming-of-age rituals like, either there or elsewhere, that you've seen? What is a secular coming-of-age ritual?
Well, the one that I wrote about in the book was at the Green Gulch Zen Center in Marin County, California. And though it's at the Zen Center, it was a secular ceremony, and it was a year-long process where these teenagers meet with mentors, and they get together once or twice a month. It's nature-based, so they're out, they're working on the farm, they're working in the woods, and each month they discuss a different value. It's came from Norm Fisher, who wrote a book, Taking Our Places, started this program many years ago. And every year a new batch of kids comes in, and it's parents who want some kind of structured way to bring their children into adulthood without, doing a bar mitzvah or confirmation. And so I went to the ceremony, and it was really beautiful. The kids stand up, and their parents read something to them, much like you might see at a bar mitzvah, or they tell them, what they've meant to them and what it has meant to be their parent. And then the mentors give the student a name, the student first says, "This is the value that I have, and this is the thing I want to give to the world. And so then the mentor gives them a name. The one woman I write about, the young woman, becomes Mountain Humor. She was born in Nepal and came from a mountain, and she's a very funny person, and so her gift to the world is her humor. And what was so lovely about this ceremony was that the kids are asked to talk about what they give to the world. And I have a 13-year-old right now, and I don't know if we've asked him that question yet, or if we'll have a structured way in which to get him to think about that. And so it was really nice to see this community come together and say, okay, you're entering adulthood. What are you going to do with your life that will be meaningful? So that was the one example I read about in the book. That there are a number of secular rituals I wrote about, but in terms of coming of age.
Okay. So one thing you talk about, and we've touched on already, is community. I think there's a chapter title you have called A Sense of Belonging.
Yeah.
Now, there's lots of ways that people can belong to things, and not all of them, some of them would survive the death of religion, right? I mean, in fact, one of the people you talk to about some of this stuff is Robert Putnam at Harvard, who's famous for writing an essay and then a book called Bowling Alone, which bemoans the demise of bowling leagues as representing a larger demise of community. But of course, bowling leagues, that's a perfect example of something you could do that has nothing to do with religion, but would presumably fill some of your need for a sense of belonging. So I guess and this raises the question of maybe we shouldn't worry so much about this. Maybe religion will get what's called kind of unbundled. In other words, different parts of religion will get performed by different things, and the sense of belonging will come from the bowling league, and how you confront death will, you'll read philosophy or you'll meditate or something. So I guess, one question I'm asking is it possible to meet the various needs that religion has met in this kind of, fragmented way? Is there a problem with that? And kind of related, well, if you want to answer that, you jump in. There's a related question, but...
Yeah. Well, I do think so. I think that there's not going to be some wholesale replacement of religion. It's too much of its own, complex entity. But my daughter, who's 10, said something recently which kind of captured what I think you're talking about. She said, well, I'm part Christian, part Jewish, and part gymnastics. And I think that where she gets her identity and her sense of belonging is on this gymnastics team that she's on, and it gives her great meaning and great purpose. She also knows she comes from these two religious backgrounds. But I think that in the modern age, we are crafting our sense of meaning and identity and belonging from a variety of streams. Mm-hmm. And some in the past, you might just say, I am this one thing. My son's question, what are we? Well, I've come to realize I can't answer that with a single word, whereas my mother could have, my father could have, and lots of people who identify as Catholic or Jewish, they would say, this is what I am. But for many of us, we're this blend of things. And yes, we find our meaning in different aspects of our life. And, people have said to me, well, how can you have grace without God? And I think that one of the arguments in the book is that because religion has been dominant for so long, these profound human experiences are often described in religious terms. So the idea of grace, which to me is just an intense feeling of gratitude that I'm here on this earth, that we're alive, is incredible wonder, just looking at the trees and the grass. And so that doesn't have to be a religious term. These ideas that have been passed down through us, and our language is still kind of, takes that history with it. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to argue in the book is that we can have that in our own secular way. Mm-hmm. And we won't replace religion, but we will piece together deeply meaningful lives without it.
So you don't need a being to feel grateful toward in order to feel gratitude.
I think that's right. I don't. I feel grateful for the fact of my life.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
And yeah.
well, let me flesh the question out, because I think traditionally when people have felt a sense of grace that, came from God, there's been involved in that often a sense of obligation in response. So it's because you've been blessed that you owe it to God to be good, to do God's works, however those may be defined. Does that? So in other words, it's a kind of an energizer and a compass or something. It's a guidance system and a kind of a fuel. Maybe I'm reading a little too much into it, but I think the idea of grace has often been used that way. You should be so grateful for what God has done for you, that X, Y, and Z. Does grace without God have some of that?
Well, yeah, that's where I think secular humanism came in for me, is to talk about the connection to other people and the earth and animals, and just the connections here and now in this moment in time, this little blip that we each get to live, is where that expression of gratitude, in terms of giving back to others and just feeling that connection. And I have to say, in these secular humanist communities, unlike in my book club or my yoga studio, I really felt a yearning to connect and to give back in the way that you're describing, that I think I'd only ever really felt in church before. And so I think there is something special about these groups that are forming that are different than, say, my son's basketball team. That they give you something a little bit more, because they are trying to help people articulate and express their values, and that feeling of grace without God. I've felt that more deeply there than in other sort of secular community pursuits.
Mm-hmm. That you said something interesting when you mentioned your daughter. I forget exactly how she put it, but the idea was that her religious identity consisted of being Christian, Jewish, and a gymnast, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that you have transmitted, it sounds like you've transmitted to her a sense of kind of Christian, in some sense, Christian affiliation or identification, and Jewish identification, affiliation, without trying to convey any of the beliefs traditionally accompanying those. Now, I don't think that's so unusual on the Jewish side. I have Jewish friends who are basically atheists, but still identify as Jewish and do the rituals. It is unusual on the Christian side.
I think it's partly because our kids are so curious about their background, and maybe because I'm in this interfaith, no faith marriage, they know that Papa is Jewish, so then what's Mama? And so they've always been curious about that. And they've always been curious about the difference between the holidays. And so I think it's definitely less, it hasn't been me really talking about Christian beliefs, but them wanting to know these terms. They really want these identifiers for themselves. She was so excited when she met another girl who had a Jewish father, or father who had been Jewish, and these people have left too, and a mother who had been Christian, because she felt like she found a fellow, person just like her. And so I think partly this push with these questions that they have is they really want an identity, and they really want to know what they are. And so I think that's where some of that has come from.
Have you come across any people who are kind of systematically trying to transmit to their kids a kind of a Christian heritage that they themselves might have grown up with, without the theology? In other words, I guess you would in other words, instead of just giving them candy eggs at Easter, you would explain, well, here's the Christian belief, and whatever you think of the belief, here's the kind of commendable part of the belief system. And same with Christmas and so on. That's I've never heard of anybody actually trying to do that. Is that something you came across?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've met a lot of people who practice the traditions in their own secular way. So I write about one woman who had been raised Jewish and left Judaism for a variety of reasons, but she thought it was really important that our kids understood that history. And so for Rosh Hashanah, she lives in New York City, one year she decided they weren't going to pay the fees to go to the high holidays, where they wouldn't understand the service anyway. So she took her kids on a bike ride around Central Square, and then they went on the carousel, and then they went home and they ate circular bread, and they talked about the circle of life, and they talked about what they regret from the past year and what they would try to do better in the coming year. And so she had transmitted, I think, important part of this Jewish holiday to her kids, but on her own terms completely. She said it was the most meaningful Jewish holiday she'd had. And again, she's detached from the community to do that. So that's what a lot of these people I met were. Some are in these organized humanist communities, and some of them are just figuring it out on their own at their own kitchen table. And it's like the Wild West right now. Everyone's trying to figure out how to make sense of this, how to carry it forward in a way that makes sense to them.
And to get back to this idea of community and belonging, let me ask a question that I think we maybe kind of covered this implicitly, but not so explicitly. So what is it that would need to be added to just a bowling league type of gathering or a book club type of gathering before you would say, okay, this is really meeting the challenge I'm describing? This is a kind of communal gathering that's filling some of the needs that were met by church when I was young.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing people talk about missing a lot is the communal singing of church with
ritual.
This huge group of people, and there's this sort of collective ritualistic experience. And some people say you get that at a football game. I've never been really moved at a football game in such a way. So I think some of it is the magnitude. It's these beautiful spaces in which a lot of this, religious practice takes place. I don't know what the answer is to that. I prefer not to be in those big, huge, spaces singing with people. I like to go out in nature. We like to take our kids to see, hiking up grand mountains, and we feel this sense of spirituality there. But in terms of belonging, I don't know. I don't think that my son's Little League team is the same as my husband's experience growing up in a synagogue. And it's hard for me to say exactly why that is. I mean, partly it's the impermanence of it. So at the end of the season, all the kids break apart, and maybe they'll come back next year, and eventually people will move on, and it'll last about, 5 or 6 years, depending how long your kid plays baseball. The Catholic Church isn't going anywhere, and it's been here for so long that there's this timelessness to it, this ability to connect through time for so long that I don't know that a bowling league captures that.
Right. Well, certainly things like bowling leagues don't have very explicit values systems. I mean, they don't, beyond like not cheating, they don't offer a lot of moral guidance, and you have a whole chapter called Moral Authority. What is your finding there? I mean, there's been a lot of kind of contention over whether religious people are more moral than non-religious people, and so on, and whether religious upbringing per se is necessary for creating morally grounded children. What did you come away from your research thinking about all that?
Yeah, so some of the most recent research I talks about how it has nothing to do with religion. Of course, we all know very religious people who are horrible and very, atheists who are wonderful. And so we know that that's not always going to be the way to morality. But what is, I think, some of the research is now showing is that kids whose parents are very sensitive and aware of injustice and empathetic transmit that to their kids. And those kids, when they do their little tests books demonstrate more awareness of what the right choice, the moral choice might be. And so I think what happens, and what I write about in the book, is when we leave these institutions, a lot of this stuff now falls on parents. And so that is where I think it gets really hard, especially in this day and age when parents are so busy. I met a woman in Minnesota who does her own secular Sunday school around her kitchen table. And it's based on the Unitarian church that she belonged to when she lived in the city, but they moved to a small town and no longer had access to that. And so I think more and more people are trying to teach their own values and their own morals and ethics to their kids in the home through their example, but also through more conscious practices like that woman had done.
Okay, so on the subject of moral guidance, one phrase that pops up in your book is the narcissism epidemic, which I actually wasn't aware of, except as a kind of an anecdotal complaint about kids these days. I mean, is that really something we should be concerned about?
Well, I mean, several researchers think so. I'm sure there's others who say no. But I was really intrigued by this because I'm raising kids in this hyper-parenting age, and our kids are being shuttled to lessons and math classes and all these things, and they're being raised in such a way that achievement is really put the priority, actually, and I had a recent experience with this where I signed my son up to play in a fundraising basketball game for the local neighborhood club here on the south side of Chicago. It raises money for working families. And 2 nights before the fundraising game, the travel team coach called and said, "We've got a game this weekend, everyone has to come." And all the kids that were going to go to the fundraiser dropped out to go do the better thing, And again, this is anecdotal, but I find it true to my experience. As a parent, we made our son go and play in the fundraiser game, and he was so disappointed until he got there and saw what it was all about and had this really great experience. At the end, his team had won the championship ball, and he decided to give it to the neighborhood club that we were raising money for. And I thought, all those parents who took their kids out of this, if this had been at church, I know they would have been there, There would have been the sense that this is what we do. We are the Jews who do this, or we are the Catholics who do this. And if we're the nuns, what is it that we do? What is it that we come together around? And what are our values that we can clearly state? And so I think the challenge to raising moral kids is clearly stating and backing it up with your actions. Like, we care about our community and we care about these families that have less than we do. And so when you've got a better opportunity, you maybe aren't going to take it. You maybe aren't going to achieve the most things today. And it's not true across the board, I'm sure, but that has been my experience raising kids, that is a challenge.
Yeah, I think, not to sound like an old guy complaining about the younger generation, I do think there is a lessened sense of commitment to commitment. I was brought up, that once you say you will do something, you will do it. If someone else is expecting you to do something, that's just the end of the story. You're not going to rearrange your plans. Right. And that's changing for reasons that I think may be inexorable in part. Part of it just has to do with all the technologies that allow you to notify people on short notice that you're not going to be doing something. It's a very different culture, and so I don't want to keep sounding like an old guy complaining, but it's a change, I think. I guess I can't threaten people who with hellfire for not fulfilling their obligations, and that's the problem, is my lack of leverage here.
There you go.
So no survey that includes people who are spiritual but not religious, which some of the nuns are, would be complete without getting into Buddhism and meditation and mindfulness and so on. And you get into that a little. So what did you find there?
Yeah, so the secular Buddhist retreat that I did at the Sipaya Zen Center was really amazing. You go, I've never been on a meditation retreat, but you assume you're going to find people who are just out to find their own bliss. And this place was specifically geared for people who work in difficult jobs. There were prison chaplains and hospital chaplains, people who do a lot of end-of-life care for people. And they were using meditation and secular Buddhist practices to help them not only get through their jobs, but help the people they were helping. And so I found that it was a really interesting twist. You know, meditation and mindfulness, it's easy to poke fun of and talk about the me generation and everyone's out doing yoga. But these people were actually doing it to then come together and to make these connections. So to me, it was secular humanism and secular Buddhism were sort of the two answers I ended up finding. I thought that using meditation as a way to sort of turn inward and calm your own central nervous system, but also become aware of your own thoughts and your own reactive ways, to then go out and do good in the world. It was sort of a nice combination. It seemed to bring in a lot of what's missing in what I described as sort of the narcissistic generation.
Mm-hmm. And I find in that tradition there's a great variety in terms of the extent to which it does translate into a sense of community. I mean, for a lot of people, it's a solitary practice, or it's a solitary practice, and then they go to a retreat once a year and see a bunch of people they don't talk to because it's a silent retreat, and then they go home. But I gather you have a sense that it can involve a strong sense of community.
This place in particular was very communal, and they mentor and they bring up people, and people can go and live there for a time and work. But what was interesting about it is that the woman Roshi Joan Halifax, who runs it, says we're here to go in only then to go back out. She doesn't want people to stay there their whole lives and just turn inward. She really wants it to be something about taking what they learn and bringing it out into the world. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the more offbeat things you encountered, it seemed to me, was this storytelling gathering, Hearth. Is that, do you want to talk about that?
Which was that?
Hearth, Hearth.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love the Hearth. So the Hearth meets in Ashland, Oregon, and it was started by a Christian minister who thinks that he wanted the secular community to get all what he calls I'm stealing all the riches of religion and giving it to all these secular people. And he was doing it in the sort of tradition of Protestant testimony, he said. And what he wanted to do is bring people together to tell their stories. These are not storytellers that are professional by any means. They practice, but they don't read notes. They stand on a stage and they tell their story. And the thing has gotten so popular that now 400 people come every time they do one of these events. They've had to find the biggest venue in town, which happens to be a synagogue. And the people tell their stories, and everyone listens, and he acts as a sort of secular minister. He gives a homily at the beginning,
but
and he wraps it up
but
at
he is
the
actually
end.
not, just to be clear, he has not lost his faith. He is still a Christian minister?
He is, but not when he's part of the Hearth.
Okay.
There's no religion at all other than that we're sitting in a synagogue. And it's really completely a secular affair. All the ticket money that they raise goes to a local charity. And then he has spin-off groups where he has smaller storytelling groups for teens, for families throughout the year. And the idea is to get to know your neighbor and to understand that, these people are struggling everywhere you look. And if you can just deepen that sense of empathy through this sort of storytelling ritual, maybe it will make us a better community. And it became really, really popular. And I talked to the rabbi at the synagogue who hosts it, and he said a lot of the people from his congregation will go to the Hearth. And now a lot of the people who came to the Hearth looked around and said, oh, I kind of miss coming to the synagogue. And so now they're coming back to services. And so there's this interesting, I think, in some of the more like liberal congregations, and then you have something like the Hearth, you can see this space being shared by people who really want the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And these are personal stories. I mean, that kind of draw people into the lives of the storyteller again.
Yeah, it's sort of like the moth on radio, but it's a little bit rougher around the edges because these are really just very regular non-storytelling people, and they're incredibly moving. They have music. They have local musicians. The night I went, there was a couple of kids from the high school came and performed with some of the older people. So again, you have that cross-generational thing. They have childcare for people who want to bring their kids. And it felt like, it could grow into something even bigger because they were trying to encompass everyone.
Okay. Are there any in your pretty extensive travels around looking at these various groups? Are there any particularly impressive things you saw that we haven't covered yet? I mean, things that you just thought really worked in this whole space, whether it's about ritual or communion or you mentioned, you have a whole chapter on the wonder of nature and appreciating the wonder of nature as a kind of a quasi-religious experience and so on. Are there any highlights here we haven't covered?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think for community, I would say the Humanist Hub in Harvard, and ones like it. There are a lot around. There's also ethical culture, which has been around a lot, but
that's more than 100 years old, I think.
Yeah, that's been around for a while. But I attended one in Brooklyn, and they had this really great children's program and pretty thriving. So I think there are these examples. I've since the book has come out, I've spoken to a number of groups, and I find that there's these great atheist groups all over, as opposed to the humanist groups, that will, pack a room with people who are eager to come together in community. And again, all ages. This one I spoke with, there were babies in the room and elderly people. So, yeah, there are these groups, and then there are individuals, and I tried to capture both. For us, it's spending time in nature. That's, I think, where we come together and feel the most sense of connection. And there's research.
You mean for your family?
Yeah, for my family. Mm-hmm. And one thing I guess I found really interesting was I've always struggled with the word spirituality because it sounds so nebulous and it means so many things. So what does it really mean? And so I wouldn't even call myself spiritual. I talked to a researcher who talked about the idea of spirituality as feeling connected to something larger, and it doesn't have to be God. Mm-hmm. It could be nature. It could be connection to your child, to the circle of life. And so once I got a sense of that, I started to realize that I was spiritual, but in a very secular way. And I looked into the research on awe and how the sense of awe is really one of the main ways we do feel connected. If we are in this experience of something great, like going to the Grand Canyon or holding a baby, and you just feel like so overwhelmed by what you're seeing, your time seems to slow down, and your sense of compassion and empathy go up. Mm-hmm. In this, because you sort of sense your smallness in the world. And so all of that was fantastic in terms of a sense of meaning.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the way the sense of smallness works. Some people find it problematic. What I mean? They look at the vast universe and go, I'm a mere speck. I'm nothing. Some people derive kind of a spiritual gratification from it. So I guess it's a matter of taste.
Yeah. Well, I used to get depressed in nature because I thought, oh gosh, I don't matter. I don't believe in God anymore, And I met Lawrence Krauss, mm-hmm. prominent atheist and cosmologist, and he said, you could think about it this way. The fact that we're all here is extremely unlikely. The universe is trying to kill us. And here we are. And so we should make the most of it. And we don't need God for that.
Right. Of course, there's some people who use the unlikeliness of it as evidence that there is a purpose, that there's something but I don't think that's the direction he takes it in. So at the end of the day, I continue to kind of find the most problematic thing death. I mean, in terms of the various places where religion has provided something, it seems to me that this, is the most challenging. What do you tell kids about death? What do you tell yourself about death? I guess it makes sense that we should close by talking a little about death. And I know you had a very traumatic. Your brother committed suicide when you were 19, and I take it that at that point you were at most vaguely religious. I gather that at that point in your life, religion wouldn't have been much of a consolation. So this kind of hit you early. What did you come away from your exploration thinking about how we should think about death and what we can tell kids about death?
Well, so that was an experience where I no longer believed in the sort of traditional God in the sky. I've sort of grown up from that. I was in college by then. But I longed for him to be alive still in some other form. And I realized that it was the longing that I was trying to soothe, and that I was trying to make it true because I wanted it so much. And I think that's maybe where I let go of belief in the afterlife, because it felt too easy to believe that he was still there. And so, my kids ask a lot of questions about death, and I write about that in the book, and how one of the things I did, I visited a death cafe, and I hung out with people. They're starting up around the country as well, and it's people who want to normalize the talk about death and talk about the fact of it, and that it happens, and that it's going to happen to all of us. And instead of being afraid of it, which I think so much of what I was trying to do in the book was unearth the things I was afraid to address with my children and with myself, with others, and just throw them out there. And so I attended the Death Cafe, and it was during a time when my youngest daughter, who was about 4 at the time, was really upset about the concept of me dying. She would come to me in the middle of the night and say, "I'll always remember you." These very dramatic, sad feelings that someday I would leave. And it was really kind of getting comfortable with it enough to talk to her that I think she then kind of dropped the subject. She would say, "What do you think happens when we die?" And I would say, "Well, I think we go into the ground, and your memories will stay alive with the people you love." And then I'd say, and other people in our family believe there's a God and that you go to heaven, and someday you'll grow up and you'll decide what you believe. But just talking about it, just having, some discussion was really, I think, what she wanted the most. Mm-hmm. And I think that soothed my own fear of it as well, just kind of blurting it out.
and it probably helps her to see you talking about it in a calm, casual, matter-of-fact way without, freaking out or showing signs of anxiety yourself. I think sometimes that's what kids want, is to just see you to discuss something that scares them without seeming scared. Right.
Well, and I met a guy. I interviewed an atheist in San Diego, and he said he's been this hardcore atheist all his life, and he has a little 4-year-old son, and they were lying in bed one night, and the son said, "Daddy, what happens when we die?" And he came this close to saying, "We go to heaven, and God takes care of us, and it's beautiful there." And he sucked it up, and he told him what he really believed, and with great trepidation. And the kid said, "Oh, okay," and he rolled over and went to bed. Yeah. So they just want to know that, we're comfortable with whatever answer we've come up with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Katherine. The book is Grace Without God, The Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Belonging in a Secular Age. Available online and in bookstores and everywhere else, and pretty recently published, right?
In June, yes.
In June, yeah. Good. Well, congratulations. And,
thank you.
And thanks for talking about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.